Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Just Talk Live. And Destiny, how are you? How are you this evening?
I'm wonderfully. Anytime when I'm in your presence doing this brings me joy. So I am happy.
Good. I am always happy to see you and to be in your presence as well. And our show today is something a little bit different. We don't often talk about academia, specifically through the lens of race and racism. And we have two amazing people that are going to be joining us. I had the wonderful privilege of having them as professors at Vanderbilt Divinity School. And so we are going to get the show started and welcome them on. How does that sound?
Sounds great, Lee.
All right. So we will welcome our guest this evening. How are y'all?
Good.
Doing well.
Good. Welcome.
Thank you.
So before we get started, we're just going to let y'all introduce yourselves. So we'll start with Eka.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. My name is Ekaputra Tupamahu. I remember one time I was driving and my son asked me, like, why your name is Eka? Why not Paul or John or something familiar, with the ears? And then I said, son, my name is the sign of my otherness here. So every time I go to Starbucks, I always have, get a new name, Edgar or AKA, all kinds of names. So, yeah. And I'm teaching now at Portland Seminary, New Testament. I did my PhD at Vanderbilt University. And, I've been teaching for a year here now, mainly New Testament. And what else? I went to school together with Jonathan. So I'm so glad to have you, to be with you all here.
And Jonathan?
My turn? Great.
Yeah, your turn.
My turn. So I am Jonathan Redding. Two things. I have Tourette's. So if you see me like winking or something, I'm not flirting with you. And if you like growl like this, I'm not trying to blow your head up like in that movie Scanners. That's just, you can imagine how much fun middle school was. And two, I'm aware of the water spot behind me. It's an old house. It's from 1908. I know it's there. It's not active. It's old. Like, cut me some slack. But I did the PhD at Vanderbilt University. I focus on Hebrew Bible, mainly apocalyptic literature, the really wild stuff, the stuff that people go crazy with. And if you Google it, like how Obama's the Antichrist, no Trump's the Antichrist, no Reagan's the Antichrist, no Eka's the Antichrist. Like it's a dime a dozen. And I teach. I'm an assistant professor of religion at Nebraska Wesleyan University in Lincoln, Nebraska, a state that is reeling right now with the potential loss of college football. And to put it in context, the University of Nebraska's football stadium, when it's full, is the third largest city in the state.
Wow. That's a football town.
Yeah.
Football town.
Man,
it's sad. I'm glad to do it. I worked with Eka a lot. Whenever Eka and I did our qualifying exams, our little cubbies were right next to each other. We would talk and pass snacks back and forth, things like that.
Yeah, it's like a little Vanderbilt reunion. I was telling Destiny today that our ministry that we do this is through the Presbyterian Church USA, and a part of the ordination process is that you have to take languages, Hebrew and Greek. And these two people happen to have taught me those languages. So Eka taught me Greek and Jonathan taught me Hebrew. So it's all full circle. So welcome. We're glad you're here. And glad to have this conversation with you. We thought this would be an important conversation because it's not often talked about. I know we had these kinds of conversations in seminary about racism within academia. So I think starting us off is just asking, where have you seen racism show up in your context as professors, specifically as professors who teach religion and who yourselves are people of faith. So this time we'll start with Jonathan about that.
Yeah, so it's you see it a variety of places. I have been on search committees at different institutions for different positions where someone who was eminently qualified for a job, one of the questions about whether or not they would do the job well was if students could understand them because of their accent. And I was like, huh? I was like, I didn't have any problem understanding them. And I was like, oh, like some of these people haven't been around anyone other than white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So that is still very much alive and well. And I wish that I could say in every one of those circumstances that people said, well, no, I mean, that's not going to be a problem. They're qualified. We should hire them anyway, because that is not the case. Sadly, much to the loss of the institutions I was a part of and the people who were deserving and worthy of those jobs. I see it in my classroom spaces when I just see a sea of white faces. Because Nebraska Wesleyan is considered one of the preeminent private colleges in Nebraska, behind Creighton. And Creighton is a big Catholic school. They have like 10,000 students, so I don't consider them to be small. But we get supposedly the best and the brightest, and there's very few students of color. And so much so that students of color get very upset with the way that they feel like the school misrepresented itself, how they are the only person of color not only in their hall, but in all their classes. And there's no sense of community for them. And it's a very lonely and frustrating thing for them. And they feel a lack of empathy from other professors, from students, from administration. So it's something that we're being very, very intentional about. And luckily we have some very strong women of color who are leading the way and doing some really great stuff at Wesleyan. And I'm like, yes. I'm like, they're like, Wesleyan's like, oh, well, we have a problem. I'm like, yeah, they've been telling you for like 10 years, but it was for 40 years. But I see a lot of that, and just you don't see, like, students are shocked when they hear about the considerable and consistent racial injustices that are throughout the nation's history, throughout the United States history, just showing them facts and talking to them about the things that the country did, like the fact that the origin of the modern police forces is in being slave catchers, right? They are like shocked by that. And many of them are shook, and they like don't know what to do. They're like, I feel like I've been living a lie. I was like, well, it means your education's paying off for you. You see, like, so we had DeRay McKesson come and speak. DeRay McKesson he called himself the OG of Ferguson. He was the guy who was on the ground in Ferguson during the protest there in 2014, and he was live tweeting it. And the horrible, horrible feedback that we got anonymously from students was really shocking. Some students referred to him as the N-word on something that, like, they knew people like us were going to read, but they knew it was going to be anonymous, so they felt safe to do it. That was quite shocking. And other professors were like, did that really happen? I'm like, yeah, like, I'm not lying. I didn't make that up. Like, that really happened. You see a lot of, in biblical studies, and I'm sure Eka's much more skilled with the linguistic aspect of this, but the troubling history of racial injustice in something and Lee, it's interesting you talked about the Hebrew and the Greek. Like, the thing that I've been really struggling with lately, and Eka, this might be a project you and I could work on at some point, but looking at how the oldest and most relied upon dictionaries and lexicons were translated by white men for white men, and how the oldest and most relied on versions of the Bible are blatantly racist in some instances. Like in Song of Songs, there is the verse where the woman is describing herself, and she says, in the King James, she says, I am black but beautiful. And Lee, remember your Hebrew at all, there is no but in Hebrew, right? It's just and. And it's I am black and beautiful, but the King James translators rendered it but. And so that's something like I've had to have discussions about with students, and some of them push back, some of them don't push back. And yes, I've talked enough. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
Echo?
Well, I think every time I think about racism, I always think at least three different levels, right? Level number one is the level of systemic one, which is something related to the written law, right? Positive law and things like that, whatever written rules and regulations. For a long time, we have that at that level, that you exclude people on the basis of their skin color or whatever racial markers they have. The second level is always the level of culture, which is, every time I talk about culture, I understand it as a habit. So social habit, behavior, something that people do all the time, is a second nature of people that, and it is always embedded in the sort of social dynamic that is often hidden, and somebody has to talk about it to put their finger on that, because it's not written, it's not clear. It's in the social dynamic that actually gives rise to the sort of systemic racism, racist system, or racist regulation, or racist law, and things like that, right? And the other level is the level of, conservatives always talk about it, the level of human heart, right? I don't want to eliminate it altogether, but there's that element of hatred toward, people who don't look like you, right? Or who don't speak like you, or, who behave differently from you. But what I'm saying is that sometimes, especially in academia, we have very clear regulation of non-discriminatory regulation. Every institution would always would abide to would follow that rules. We're not going to discriminate people on the basis of this and that and this and that. But underneath that, I think that is way more interesting than looking at the written law. And what is the behaviors? What is the habitual behaviors of the people in academia, for instance? So, because our field is in the New Testament, my field is in New Testament, and Jonathan is a Hebrew Bible, so in biblical studies, we know exactly that, for a long time, the biblical studies have been dominated particularly by white voices and white concerns, white questions. And because of that, we are all trained in that particular sort of cultural environment, right? So Jonathan has talked about a lot of things, but I just want to pinpoint to this particular issue of how we are conditioned to think in a certain way, right? To ask certain questions. And by doing that, we actually abandon our questions, we abandon our concerns. So if you are familiar with biblical studies, for instance, biblical studies have been embedded in German scholarship in the 18th century, 19th century, and then it was further developed in UK and then in America. And that's basically the conversation in biblical studies today in the United States. And people like Sean Kelly, for instance, has written a book on how biblical studies in Germany, for instance, was embedded in a deeply racialized discourses that happens in Germany in the 19th century. People like Immanuel Kant, people like Martin Heidegger, and and those people who have been deeply ingrained in anti-Jewish, anti-blackness and things like that. And it became the trend in biblical studies, right? The study of historical Jesus is also embedded in that kind of discourses. So the challenge is now is how do we, as biblical scholar, how do we destabilize and decenter this, right? Decenter this sort of dominant voice from the West, from the white male, particularly white male voices and the concerns and the questions. And it's very interesting because in biblical scholarship, historical criticism, for instance, becomes the standard for biblical studies. If you don't do it, you are not quote unquote the real scholar. So what I'm saying is that this is particularly a way of pushing voices that are not asking the questions that white male scholars are asking, right? I mean, whether Jesus, what Jesus looked like in the in the year of 25, for example, I don't really care. That's not my that is not my question. I don't, people are dying on the street. I don't ask that question, right? Why do I have to spend all my life asking and then being concerned with that particular question? So, and what happened is this thing is still very much the dominant sort of the dominant way of doing scholarship. If you don't do it, if you don't know these things, if you don't know German, if you don't know French, then you're not a real biblical scholar, for instance, right? So that's why we are all conditioned, we are all trained, and we are all, I would say, in a Foucauldian term, we are all disciplined, right? We are being disciplined in that kind of thinking. So it's not written, but it is something that you have to look down into the social habits and cultural habits of this field of academia, and you can put your finger and say, hey, there's something going on here that actually pushes aside, marginalizes different voices. And I see that as a form of racism in biblical, particularly in the field of biblical studies. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan. Eka, it's nice to have you with us. And I just want to put out there, I did not go to seminary, but I feel as if a lot of the issues that you are bringing up can be widely spread to other schools and disciplines that go beyond the biblical context. But we thank you that you're here as people of faith and sharing how it has a direct correlation, even when we're trying to portray and live into good faith models. You too touched upon a wide variety of issues that we need to dive deeper into. But the one that I kind of want to lift up, that I kind of heard from both of you speaking, one is, how can we know we can't change the systems, right? At least probably not in our lifetime. Systems are going to be the systems, and we can start chipping away at them slowly. But as two professors, how can you and people who walk alongside you to advocate to make community schools, seminaries, and other places more inclusive communities for people of color, for them to be more, feel a sense of community? You both lifted up the system. Eka isn't, it's from a white man perspective, and Jonathan, some of the issues that you talked about, examples directly from your students. So what you named what you have done, but can you talk a little bit more about how others can incorporate those methods to make communities of color more welcomed in the academia world?
Jonathan, you want to say something about it?
Sure. So there's, for people that may be listening or very interested, there's a book that I cannot recommend enough. I'm going to butcher the name. I'm going to butcher the last name because I'm from the South and it's rough. It's a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Free or Paulo. I'm mispronouncing that horribly, but if I've read it, I loved it. It changed the way I teach. It changed the way look at pedagogy and the purpose of education and teaching of education, because what it does is it shows how systemic white supremacy is woven into the structures of education and education systems. And the reason that it's allowed to thrive is because the system is designed for it to thrive. And so you have to find ways to lead students into having deeper conversations. Mm-hmm. For me, that's the thing that I tell people. Like we have to lead students because they're the next generation of people who can actually change the systems, right? And like Destiny, I'm gonna be my wife calls me a what's it called? So she says I'm an optimist, but not really. I forget the the phrasing she uses with it. Yes, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Look at that on the bottom. Highly recommend it. Get it, buy it, live it, do it. But I think we can change the systems. And I think that when we teach students on an individual level to push back against things, to challenge a little bit where they came from, that sows the seeds of changing the systems, right? That, like, for example, one of the best students that I had she wasn't even a major, she was a minor. She was going to be an elementary school teacher. And we read chapters of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And she was like, this is going to change how I teach my second and third graders, right? She's like, I'm going to find ways to elevate different voices and understand that when a student's misbehaving, it's not because they're a bad kid. It's because maybe they process things differently. Maybe they need to have more unstructured time. Maybe they need more structure in their structured time, right? It's about finding ways to sow the little seeds for students to plant and grow, because there are some students that, like, when I first started Nebraska Wesleyan, there's a young woman I'm thinking of in particular. She was so scared to take one of my classes. She like started crying the first day. And I was like, what's wrong? And she was like, I'm just afraid that you're going to make me an atheist. And I said, I'm not an atheist. And she said, you're not? I'm like, no.
I'm a reverend.
Exactly, the title reverend. Now she like is able to go back to her parents and have real organic discussions about Black Lives Matter and the parallels between the pushback that Black Lives Matter is receiving with the pushback of Dr. King. I mean, you can show the hate mail that Black Lives Matter leaders receive, and it is word for word the same what Dr. King received. And so in those instances, like that's one thing I try to do, is I try to use historical examples that are basically the same thing so that people don't feel called out. Like, it's more of like let's look at this situation. What can we learn from this situation? They're like, oh, people said Dr. King was, they called him terrible names and said he should die. And they asked what about black on black crime and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, yeah. And does that happen now? And they're like, yeah. And it's like, where? It's like, my parents say that. It's like, oh, okay. Well, let's talk about that. Yes. Yeah. Eka.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that. Thank you. And I feel like there is the need for decentering that whiteness, right? In especially in our classroom, and I've been wrestling with this really as a person of color, who embodies different. Basically, my students, I would say maybe 90% were whites, so to stand in front of your student as a embodied otherness, right? Who speak differently, right? With an accent, who look different, who think differently. So, and also, I remember last semester I taught a class on biblical interpretation, and then, so I began with introducing to them the, historical critical methodology. What is the history of the development of this particular method? It was actually an obsession of white men in the 19th century, right? It's an obsession, with the objectivity of the history, that you somehow can bypass the text, right, and then go to the actual thing, basically. So text is seen as a window to see. So that becomes a trend in biblical scholarship. And I say that since the 1970s, and then I begin to give them different readings. So in 1970, you begin to have people who talks about the female experience, for instance, and then people who talk about the racial discourses in the biblical text. People who talk about sexual dynamic, gender dynamic in the biblical text. And by doing that, not only introducing them with different text, right? I also bring different professors to come, invite them to come and speak, so that they not only read, but also they hear and see the connection. I always believe that otherness is always scary when you are in far distance from the other, right? I've seen people who talk about Islam as really bad, are usually people who live in that bubble, never had like, a Muslim friend, never. So, by bringing these people, by bringing otherness close to the face of the dominant group, right? By doing that, you are destabilizing this and creating a more, I would say it would create a more hospitable space for otherness. What is hospitality, right? Hospitality is all about how do we deal with others. I mean, when the other comes and knock the door, what do? Right? And sometimes people look otherness, sort of people think about otherness only at the skin level, right? But if you go deeper in that, you're talking about that different way of thinking, different life experience that creates such thinking, right? And people become so uncomfortable, right? When you begin to challenge the dominant discourse, for instance, people become so uncomfortable with that. And I basically told my students, you will be uncomfortable in this space. You will be uncomfortable. And I remember one at the end of the class, one student said, it's so hard for me to unknow this, in the evaluation, because sometimes what happened in biblical studies, especially when you are trained in a certain system, like Jonathan mentioned, certain system of education, that you only read these white men scholars and their concerns and things like that. What happened is when you teach, you always bring these people, because you will never teach something that you don't know. Right? You will never do it. But if you're not trained in that, you cannot do it. You have to force yourself to go outside the bubble. So what happened is the circle has been already going like this. I would say maybe out of so many PhD programs in the United States, I would say maybe only a handful, and Vanderbilt is one of them maybe, and I would say that really we have people like Fernando Segovia, we have people like A.J. Levine, we have people like, what is his name, Xiao, and, Dr. Emily Town. What is it? Sorry.
Dr.
Marbury. Yeah, we have so many embodied diversity of voices that it's so hard for you to like unnotice. I mean, you know that there is no single story in biblical studies, right? There's no only one story, one true story. No. It's a great diversity of voices that ask different questions that are, to me, maybe are more relevant to the context and the situation that that particular community is facing, right? So I ask my students, for instance, when you write your paper, don't ask a question that a guy in UK asked in early 19th century or in the early 20th century. Because maybe that guy is facing a different situation than your situation, And then we need to flip the scholarship back instead of bringing this sort of, whatever established scholarship back to the church. I feel like we need to bring the issue and concerns of people on the pews in their community to scholarship. So the direction should be like this instead of direction should be like this. For a long time, I've been studying, like, you learn all the nuggets of truth here, and then you apply it over here. And I was like, no. You have to turn it around. You have to go from here, and then you bring it and think about that situation seriously and bring it into scholarship. So scholarship can deal with these issues as well. So I think that is the way to make the space more hospitable for different voices and different concerns.
Yeah, and I like what you were talking about, that this makes people uncomfortable. I mean, I remember I was a little further along than some people were when divinity school happened, but Vanderbilt has this reputation of really just tearing down everything you ever thought about when you grew up, everything you thought about your Christianity and the Bible and all these kinds of things. And I remember people being terrified. I remember people having breakdowns. I remember people just going through just kind of a grieving process, and some people getting angry. And actually, just as we're talking right now, I just had to delete 2 comments because people were mad about what we're talking about right here. And it is such a fearful conversation when we're touching the Bible or when we're touching Scripture. And so I wonder, since that is something that is very hard for people to grasp when we're talking about translation and when we're talking about the Greek language, and all these kinds of things, and when we're really digging deep into all of that stuff, as we did in seminary, and I wonder, how do we talk about this? Because not everybody is as privileged as we were and are to have this type of conversation and to have this type of education. And so I wonder how do we continue those conversations, specifically when people get they put up a wall and they are firm in it, and they get angry when you say, well, this didn't really mean that, or this didn't really say that because there wasn't really a word for that then. And we talk about language, and I know, Eka, that is something that is a lot of your work. But right now we are seeing it as we're talking. That this is we have an angry emoji up here, so I wonder, how do we have these types of conversations that are productive, but also saying that there are issues here with language and translation and learning about the text and the undergirding of racism within it. That's a big question, but I do think that we should talk about it, because it does affect people positively, but also affects them very negatively as well.
Yeah, I would say, translation is a huge issue in itself, right? Because it's there's been a lot of discussion on translation. Even if we think about it, interpretation is actually as an act of translation, right? So when you try to explain something again, you're actually translating it, whether you like it or not, right? When I read a book and I say that, let me describe the book again, I'm actually translating that book. So there is that act of translation within the language itself. So it's not just like transferring a language from a different language from source language to a target language, right? But the other thing that I want to point out about translation is that the translation is never. I work in different in many languages at the same time, because English is not my first language. So translation is never a transfer of word, or exact text from one text to the other. Never. So if you do translation, exactly. It's almost impossible to do it. So I remember reading one of the key figures actually in critical theory school of thoughts. What is his name? Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin has some essays on translation and language, but this is basically what he says, and I think he's correct. Is that translation is not transferring of meanings or transferring of word but translation is actually a recreating of a text, right? You rewrite the text, you create a new text, and that is a messy. When you recreate a text, when you rewrite the text, it becomes a messy political space. Right? Musa Dube has a fantastic article in Journal for the Study of New Testament talking about how the missionaries, when they went to Botswana in Africa, and they translated the Bible, they translated the word demons and Satans and demons using the word ancestors. So she was like, it's unreal experience of reading the Bible in that And in that version of of the Bible, now in the Bible, my ancestors, he said, has become demons and Satan that needs to be cast out and exorcised. Speaking of the politics, so so basically, if I'm translating that article too, but if I understand correctly, she's basically saying that this is an act of killing my culture. And then what's more interesting is that this particular version of the Bible in that language is treated like King James Version in the English language, meaning to say that they really revere it, they revere it. They really lift it high as though that is the Bible, right? That's the translation of the Bible. So it's a messy political space.
And that makes me think of a paper that I was inspired to write, and with my abundant free time, I wrote a book on it. Eka, all we professors do is teach like 2 classes, and then we have it's free time. It's like pastors. Pastors only preach on Sundays, and then their work's done, right? But no, it's the way that Malcolm X in his autobiography was critical of dictionaries. In the use of like how they interpreted black versus white, or how they define black versus white. And in one instance, like they just got it wrong. Like they said that then the dictionary was so racist, the English dictionary was so racist, they said that black was the absence of color and white is every color in the spectrum, when that's wrong. It's the opposite. White is the absence of color and black is every color on the spectrum. And so like I remember I was just shook by that. So I wrote a paper for Segovia, Fernando Segovia. For anyone who's out here viewing, Google him and find his work. He is a fantastic scholar. He's at Vanderbilt, on the use of black and white in the book of Revelation, and the racial tension and the white supremacist undertones of the way that black and white have been interpreted and translated in Greek lexicons and Hebrew lexicons. I mean, it's there's such a hierarchy of even something as simple as starting at the dictionary level and the lexicon level, right? They list definitions as primary based on usage, which is fallacious, right? Yeah. Just because it's used one way does not mean that that's the best way to translate the word. And that also is reinforcing ideas of like, this is how me as this translator says this word should be translated, so I'm going to put it in a dictionary and my name is going to be way down at the bottom of some front page as an editor, and you're going to think this is the truth, this is the capital T truth. But this dictionary was made by someone with a particular agenda, and we have to question that agenda. We have to push back against that agenda. It's like the King James example that I used, right? I mean, the black but beautiful is, it's supposed to be black and beautiful. I mean, that's what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew says and. The Hebrew does not say but. And I mean, there's such an ingrained hierarchy of white supremacy, English-speaking white supremacy in biblical language textbooks, that one of my professors at Vanderbilt, Annalisa Atzoni, that's how she learned English. She learned English when she was learning Hebrew, because the only textbooks that she had available to her were Hebrew textbooks in English. There weren't any good Italian grammars. And so like that again creates self-reinforcing hierarchies. The best grammars are written in English by English-speaking scholars. And 9 times out of 10, those scholars are building their work off of traditionally white male, usually Protestant scholars. And so it creates these self-reinforcing loops that will drive you mad. Like I was laying up like last night, I almost text Herbert Marbury at Vanderbilt and be like, what do I do? Like what am I supposed to do? Like it's so ingrained in it that we can't even escape it. And I may text him later. Yeah, and also just the idea of interpretive polyvalence, right? The weight that people put on certain interpretations. Like Eka, you said the definition of demons is ancestors. Within some cultures, demons are metaphorical, where in other cultures they are literal. but using that word, because in English, when you say I have some inner demons, like I don't believe that I literally have demons inside of me I have to fight off. But in other cultures, like that, there's that gap. I mean, that's why Google Translate is constantly being updated, right? Google Translate, you think Google, one of the most powerful companies in human existence, would get translation, but that's how difficult translating is that Google can't figure out Google Translate in such a way, because you just can't do it. Like it's impossible. So I look at it though from the perspective of, like Eka has said, we have to open up the discussion and we have to reevaluate how we do these things and bring in different voices, right? We have to create space for different voices. And this may get me in trouble, but I don't care. You blocked that guy, and I blocked him too. That's why I'm a huge fan of affirmative action, right? In order for these voices to be heard, spaces have to be created for them. I mean, as much as organizations like the Society of Biblical Literature and the American Academy of Religion talk about their prioritizing of diversity, there are not enough people of color who get those opportunities, because elementary schools are terrible, because their childhoods are bad because their parents have to work 2-3 jobs. They grow up in substandard housing. Like, I mean, they are like the book that just came out. They're stamped from the beginning. They are trying to run a race when they're not even in the same arena yet. And so I look at it from the scholarship perspective, just taking some notes and thinking about it. Like it's the manifestation of all the shortcomings of the global education system. The fact that people in SBL are like, we need to have more diverse voices. It's like, great, we have to change the systematic problems in American public education. And they're like, what? And it's like, yeah, like you can't go to a creek and expect to catch a marlin, right? You have to first get ocean water, then put marlins in it, and then go fishing for a marlin. That may be a poor example, but like we wonder, like, why are there no black voices? Why are there very few Latinx voices? It's like, well, because they don't have the same opportunities that white kids like me had. They didn't have parents who had the time, who were blessed with the time that they had jobs that they could leave at work and come and spend time with us at home. Like it's like a hydra of different problems. When you cut off one head, like 2 or 3 more take its place, and it points to the much larger, like Eka said, the much larger systemic issues.
Yeah, I think, and I really, so one class that really changed, like Dr. Azzoni, if you are out there, Annalise Azzoni, that history class changed my life, because we really talked about how, in many ways, the racism and the white supremacist rhetoric around, specifically when we're talking about the Canaanites, when we're talking about that history of who is the enemy and who is the other and who is the outsider, who is primitive, when we're talking about primitive ways of being, when the standard and the comparison is Western white culture that is it being compared to, and changing how we view history, even, and not even, and kind of going for translation and in the history of it all, just reorienting our minds to think that, like, coming at people of different cultures with the automatic judgment of inferiority. And that is also racism and white supremacy to the core in teaching history. But I also think as people of faith, we can't have this conversation, and Eka mentioned it, without talking about mission, without talking about missionaries, because they were the educators in many ways, and were the bearers of this racist, white supremacist education. And we are the inheritors of that. We work for the church. Destiny and I work for the National Office of the Presbyterian Church USA. And we are having these conversations now. And we just got a heart from Dr. Azzoni. Love you, girl. And we are having these conversations now about mission, right, Destiny? Like, conversation, yeah.
Yeah, And to what Leah is saying, even within inside a denomination, and I'm pretty sure this can be evaluated in other denominations, how history is written over times to be seen as the person or the people who liberated the oppressed, when really you were the one oppressed, perpetuating the oppression. With even in our Presbyterian church in my own denomination in Carlisle back home, we held I guess conversion camps for indigenous people because they were savages. You know, that's a history that we suddenly forget as Presbyterians, and even living into our mission models today of going out and spreading the good news came at a price to those cultures and those people. So as even you mentioned it, Jonathan, how people today celebrated Martin Luther King Jr., but being a Martin Luther King scholar, we know that he was persecuted left and right, not only by white people, but Black people too did not appreciate the movement, just like BLM. So as people of faith, like Lee was saying, how do we live in lifting up the stories, telling the history, and really living into, I guess, to do more good than harm, and not go into this context of whitewashing or rewriting history.
Yeah. Speaking of mission, I remember Dr. Mitzi Smith at Columbia Theological Seminary has a fantastic article on Great Commission, right, in Matthew chapter 28, and how it somehow becomes the Great Commission, right? Out of so many commandments in the Bible, somehow this thing became a great one, right? But I like the arguments he puts there. It number one, historically speaking, it has something to do with the expansion of the European colonial power all over the world, because when the Europeans go all over the world, it's not just only to exploit the places outside Europe, but also to preach the gospel. So the gospel and the mission, particularly modern missionary movement, went hand in hand with colonial expansion, right? So it has something to do with this colonial and imperial expansion of the European power. But not only that, she argues that I agree completely with her, is that this particular text has been understood as going and be a teacher. So once you go to another space and you become a teacher, you already create a structure of hierarchy, whether you like it or not. You already created it. Number one, and number two, teaching has always been understood as transferring a certain knowledge and certain, so it's very much like Gnostic kind of, if you have this certain knowledge, you will be safe and you will be free, right? So you'll be taught a certain doctrines, a correct doctrine and correct dogma, and it becomes sort of a way of transferring knowledge, basically knowledge production that has been produced, accepted as the standard in Europe and in American context, to other parts of the world, to make everyone think like them, right? And she said, we need to reread this text altogether.
Yeah.
So and she argues that if you read the whole thing of the Gospel of Matthew, I don't have time to go one by one the Gospel of Matthew, but if you read the Gospel of Matthew, you will see that the work of social justice, the work of bringing equality and working for the marginalized and the oppressed, is actually part of the mission of Jesus. It's not just teaching doctrine and transferring knowledge that has been established and received here as the quote unquote orthodox knowledge that you have to have in order to be safe, quote unquote, right? So, Jonathan, you want to say something? Go ahead.
No, yeah, and what you were saying about that made me think of the whole notion of the weighted privilege of being literate, and how many people were taught to read and speak English based on King James Bibles by missionaries. It was something that was forced down their throat. It was something that was exploited to them. And it's interesting too, because slave owners used to prohibit everyone knows that slave owners used to prohibit slaves from learning how to read and write, because they understood that if enslaved persons could read and write, then they could band together and they could take everything down. So reading and writing, words have power. But the work of Herbert Marbury, his book Pillars of Fire, and I forget what it's called. It's his Exodus book. It's an awesome book. He talks about how enslaved peoples who even were allowed to read, they were given and edited and redacted Bibles, many times without the book of Exodus. Because the book of Exodus is literally a story, one giant story about God liberating enslaved people, and what happens to the slave owners? They end up dead on a beach because God drowned them. And that really sticks with me, because what that does, Eka, what that goes back to your Great Commission issue, is that it creates like an interpretive canon within the canon, and it's stuff that's not on the text. It's stuff not in the text. It's stuff that people put onto the text. And they become so wedded to it that when you point out otherwise, they like have this existential spiral where they say that you're wrong, or they say that you're being manipulative. It's like, no, like I'm just saying, like, this, your reading is not operative. The only reason that your reading is operative is because you've just been told over and over and over again, right? Like pillars of cloud and fire. And so, Eka, that goes back to, not only did Jesus do the work of social justice and equity, but he also attacked systems. Right? Jesus was openly opposed to the Roman government. Right? I always read the story of the example Jesus gives: render under Caesar what is Caesar's and what is God's. I think that's Jesus being a smart aleck, saying, ain't nothing Caesar's, everything's God's. Whereas my whole life, I've been heard like there are some things for the government and there are some things for God, and that's why we should pay taxes. But now when I read like the stuff like from Fernando Segovia or James Cone or womanist interpretations, are like, nah, like Jesus was literally being like, hey, government, shove it, right? Like, because I mean, you can read it and almost like sarcastically. And when I tell students that, like, some students get upset and they say, but that's not what happens. I'm like, well, prove it. I'm like, prove it the other way. Like, prove Jesus's intent outside of what other people have said that you're saying. And they struggle to do it because they can't do it. And so something to go back to a question you asked earlier, Destiny, like, how do we teach these things, is, I'm open and honest with my students, right? I tell them I'm an open book. I tell them on day one, I'm a liberal Democrat. I voted for Hillary Clinton. I voted for Barack Obama. I'm going to vote for Joe Biden. But then I tell them, I said, your political allegiance does nothing in terms of your grade in this class.
And Kamala Harris, don't forget.
Kamala Harris, yes. Zilch, nada, right? If you're a conservative student, I don't care. If you believe everything I believe, I don't care, right? That will in no way, shape, or form affect your grade. And that helps building the rapport, right? Like building the rapport, showing the students that I'm not here to like aha them and be like a 1910s Western villain, like twirling my mustache, waiting on them. Like I'm just wanting them to learn and to understand what they believe and why they believe it. Right? They don't have to change anything they believe, but they better damn well know why they believe it and where it comes from and what it is. And I have found that people open up themselves more to that, right? It's like, Eka, like you said, your work with your interpretation class, and you show them the historical criticism and almost the fetishization of historical critical work by scholars in the 1800s and 1900s. The thing that I show students is like the modern notion of written history. Every history is biased, right? No history is not biased. Now I go back to Josephus. I start with Josephus. I'm like, yo, Josephus was paid by the Romans to write a history. And I always say, and so how do you think he portrays the Romans in that history? They're like, he portrays them positively. I'm like, why is that? And they're like, because they were writing the checks. Like, because they were writing the checks, right? Like, it's not like even our oldest history is biased, right? That's just the way it is. right? Everybody's biased. I'm biased. You're biased. Let's just get it out in the open, right? Let's not act like that we're here trying to do something objective. We are talking about biases, people. Come on up. Come on down. Yeah. The water's fine. Or however you want to do it. But a lot of it, Destiny, like it takes, I show my students that I care about them as people, right? I show my students that who they are matters. Their story matters. What they do matters. I don't just teach, like the work that I do in the classroom is minimal compared to the stuff. Like I go to their sporting events. I go to their music recitals. I go to see their art. I go to their fraternity and sorority fundraisers. I do all that stuff just to be visibly present for them to see that, like, you know, I'm not the boogeyman. I'm not the professor from the movie God's Not Dead, which weirdly was the guy who played Hercules, which I always thought was strange. I'm like, all right.
I mean, that movie is so unreal. I mean, nobody in the
exactly is doing right? Like I tell students that I'm on sometimes early, like it's starting to fall out of vogue because a lot of students haven't seen it. But I'm like, I don't think God is dead, right? That's absurd. Like that book is a fantasy. I've yet to meet a professor who ever really believes that. But yeah, that's yes.
No, I agree. What happened with that movie is that fear of the other, right? Fear of the space that challenges the way you think, right? And that's why they portrayed it as like the professor is actually trying to convince them that, you know, God doesn't exist. I mean, nobody's doing in academia.
Yeah, like whenever
except for some fanatics, you know, professors maybe only 1 or 2%, or maybe non-existent.
Yeah.
Right. So it's the fear of unknown, right?
Exactly, the fear of the unknown. And so that's whenever a student comes to my class and they say, I've read Richard Dawkins, and I'm an atheist. And I say, Richard Dawkins is a hack. And they're like, what? I'm like, because Richard Dawkins, he says in his books that his concept of what he says is God is based on Western notions of God. And he's been asked, so what about Hindu or Buddhist notions? And he says, and I quote, I haven't read them. I don't know, but it's basically the same. And it's like, no, they're not. You don't, like, when someone's like militantly atheist, I'm like, okay, prove to me that God doesn't exist. They're like, boo, boo, boo. I'm like, yeah, no, you can't. So it was the same with like, yeah, I get very wrought up with this. You can't tell.
Yeah, I may add one more thing also that I feel very healthy for me, particularly too. But I tell my students the same thing, that we have to maintain this sort of two different sort of, what do you call it? Two different extremes, if I may use that word, right? We have to walk in between that. Extreme number one is the extreme of totalitarianism, meaning to say that I close myself. I don't want to hear anybody else. I know I'm the only one who is right, which is many Christian apologists have particularly this particular approach, right? You know, when I encounter the other, when I encounter people, I come to them as a warrior who is ready to shoot them down, right? So that's one of the approach, right? Totalitarian approach, totally extreme, if I may use.
Extremism is extremism, regardless of what end of the spectrum politically it's on.
Exactly. And then the other one would be, I would say, you know, anything goes. You know, I don't have any system at all. And I said, no, everyone has system. Everyone has system. But the question is whether you want to close the system up or not. I have lived in a space back in Indonesia in 1965. There was a mass killing in Indonesia. And for many, many years, we had to sit in classroom in Indonesia every in that date in Indonesian calendar, national calendar, we had to watch a movie created by a government, and every dissenting voices will be shut down by the government, will be captured and things like kicked out from. So I said, I have lived in the space in which otherness is completely shut off, and it becomes oppressive, right? But you don't want to go to this extreme too, that you don't have identity even at all. So what I'm saying is that, you know, you have to think about whatever system you have, the ethical system, social belief. You everyone has that, but don't close it up. Don't live with a single story. What is her name? Talk about the danger of single story. Don't live with that. You have to open up yourself so that every day you learn something new. Right? When you encounter people who think different than you, instead of shooting them down, listen. That attitude of listening, right? Of being hospitable,
No. And I may be, and not to shut anybody down, but we are at an hour, and I just think that this was a great conversation, and I'm very appreciative of you both.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I think this is something that everyone needs to hear, and I hope people watch this because I think this could open a lot of people's minds and hearts. Yeah. Jonathan?
And one more thing, like before I go, people who will listen to this and they'll say, well, he doesn't like the Bible, he's a liberal. That is not true. There is nobody, me and Eka can fight about it. There is nobody on the planet that loves the Bible more than I do. I'm obsessed with it. I know how to read it in multiple languages. I read it and wrestle with it. I think about it every day, right? Every day I think about it. I spend time with the Bible. I'm critical of the Bible because I love it so much, right? It's like a partner, right? It's like I want my wife to be critical of me and to hold me to a high standard because like that's who I want to be, and I do that with her too. Like the Bible, ain't nobody love church and ain't nobody love the Bible more than me. So if anybody wants to claim, if anyone wants to claim that I'm here to try to destroy Bibles and destroy Christianity, the opposite is true.
That is true, yes. And I would say we all love the Bible, or else we wouldn't be here talking about it. So again, we are grateful. Destiny, it is so good to see you again.
Yes, likewise. And thank you, Eka and Jonathan, for coming on. I was a little nervous having two professors on from seminary, and it'll be really high level theology based that will put me to sleep. But this has been an enriching conversation, to say the least. I have enjoyed you two, and I don't know, maybe we can do a part 2 later on when we
part 2. This coming down the road.
Like,
sign us up.
You almost convinced me to go to seminary. Almost.
We really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank y'all so much. And we will be back the same time next week, Tuesday, 6 p.m. Eastern time. Just Talk Live. We will be here. And so until next time, siblings.
You almost